Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Active Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Simonik. Today, we'll be discussing the different ways we tend to experience the world from the perspective of left and right brain processes. Our guest today is Dr. Chris Niebauer, a cognitive neuropsychologist who is a tenured professor at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on consciousness, mindfulness, left and right brain differences, and artificial intelligence. He is the author of The Neurotic's Guide to Avoiding Enlightenment, How the Left Brain Plays Unending Games of Self-Improvement, and his most recent and popular, No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. In this groundbreaking book, he writes that the latest research in neuropsychology is now confirming a fundamental tenet of Buddhism, what is called anatta, or the doctrine of no self. Niebauer writes that our sense of self, or what we commonly refer to as the ego, is an illusion created entirely by the left side of the brain. He had found this Buddhist neuroscience connection when he was a student in the early 1990s, but since then this connection has practically become its own genre in bookstores. Today, Niebauer admits that we're just beginning to scratch the surface on the link between Eastern philosophy and the latest findings in psychology, neuroscience, and what this really means for the human experience. So please help welcome Dr. Chris Niebauer.
Question, and it's always nice to start off with definitions and see where we're at, and you say, okay, neuropsychology, and if you look it up in a textbook, it's going to give you something like the study of how mind and brain work together, or the study of how various thinking processes are housed in different parts of the brain. And so for a long time, psychologists, to give you an example, for a long time, psychology studied memory. Neuropsychology came along and said, okay, that's great. We know all this stuff about memory, but where is it taking place in the brain? And so that's the thing. And actually, that to me has been the most outstanding success of neuroscience or neuropsychology or cognitive science. It goes by a lot of different phrases, but the whole neuro enterprise has been so successful in mapping out various cognitive functions in different places in the brain. I mean, we knew some of this a while back. For example, something as basic as vision takes place in the visual cortex, but they've gotten so fine detailed with it, where empathy and the specifics of language have been mapped out, and things like math and numbers, and we just have so many particular psychological functions that we know exactly where in the brain we know the place in the brain where if it's damaged, you lose that ability. And these get so detailed. Like there's this angular gyrus, and it's just a little bump in the back of the brain. If it's damaged, people can still write, but they lose the ability to read. And I find that shows you how detailed this stuff is. Imagine writing a note, and you can write it out, and it all makes sense to everyone around you except you. You can't go back and read it because you've lost that one particular ability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you ever read Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct?
A while back, yeah.
Yeah, it's an older book. He discusses that very thing where the grammar and syntax is instinctive and it's embedded in the brain in these neural pathways, but it's very, very specific. So it's a pretty interesting book.
Hey, that's the interesting thing about evolutionary psychology, which is pretty recent. And so, if you look at what happened in psychology, we were a blank slate for a long time. That was the behaviorist movement. And that went up even to the 70s and 80s. Then evolutionary psychology came along and saying, no, we're hardwired and we have mating preferences, and they'd give a whole list of things that we thought were under our own choice.
Yeah.
But it turns out we're just hardwired, and it's nothing from our personal experience. It's from the experience of the species. So we've got this genetic coding for doing very particular behaviors, and that's still kind of a controversial thing people are debating, because we don't know. We know it's some, but we don't know how much of us is influenced by that evolutionary history.
Yeah. Has there been a revolution in neuroscience in the past 10 or 15 years?
I think the neuroscience, they're continuously going under revolutions, because for a long time we were in this idea, that's the birth of neuropsychology or neuroscience, was that we don't have a brain, we are a brain.
Right.
And that is the simplest way to put it, that all of who we are comes down to those 87 billion neurons, those little processing cells in the brain. And that's our identity. And that's like Francis Crick, when he wrote The Astonishing Hypothesis. That was the astonishing hypothesis, that you can take all of mental experience, what it means to be human, all of our humanity, and it comes down to that 3 pounds of gelatinous goo in your skull that that's what it is, responsible for the whole beginning and end of humanity is the brain.
Yeah.
But I think neuroscience is really going under, it's changing almost daily. I teach a class in artificial intelligence, and I say how difficult it is to teach because AI is progressing at an exponential rate, so it makes it very difficult to keep up. But neuroscience is kind of in that same situation because we know so much about neuroscience now, but we don't know what to do with it philosophically.
Mhm.
And that's why I like to uh, uh, get into what's called cognitive science, which is it's a collection of different disciplines. It's interdisciplinary, so it's not just neuroscience, but it also includes the philosophy of neuroscience. So we might be able to understand exactly what does this mean,
Mhm.
and it goes beyond just kind of the simple version of neuroscience that you are a brain. It sort of puts it in the bigger picture of the human condition.
Yeah. A large part of your talks and your writing is a lot about Eastern thought, um, Eastern philosophies of no self. Well, you had that book, No Self, No Problem. Did your study in Buddhism, Taoism come first, and then it meshed well with yours, neuroscience, or did neuroscience come first?
Well, psychology came first, and that was my undergrad. And again, like so many psychologists, I just had my own personal issues, and I thought psych would have an answer for me. And then I was right at that moment in the 90s where like Congress was saying that was the decade of the brain, and that was like at the birth of neuroscience. So when I chose a graduate program, it just made sense to go into neuropsychology. So that was really attractive. I thought, well, all the answers would be there. So I actually had my beginnings were really in Western neuroscience, and but it just I had that feeling something was missing. It was like you're putting a puzzle together, but there's this big piece, there's a gap, and that's when I started reading Alan Watts, and he was so fascinating for me because he just seemed so absolutely genuine and honest, but he also seemed to have a way of talking about Taoism, Advaita Vedanta, and Hindu. He could just take all these different, Zen in particular, he could take all these different traditions, and he explained them so well to a Westerner that to me, I felt so pulled into it that I thought, well, he, this might be that last piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And I think it was. And I think,
Yeah.
at least for me, it was.
Yeah, yeah. I really respond well with Alan Watts too, and I had discovered him a few years back. Is there a separation between the two that you have to be careful as a neuropsychologist not to cross that boundary?
Well, I've already crossed the boundary, so there's not much I can do to turn back from it. And I think the boundaries are really how serious you take the brain to be. To be a real legitimate fundamental neuroscientist, you have to say we are a brain. We don't have a brain, and consciousness. And really, the most important part of that is the emerging study of consciousness. To be a neuroscientist, a classic neuroscientist, a conservative neuroscientist, you have to say that consciousness is produced by the brain. That without brain there is no consciousness, and I've gone past that boundary. Well, the way I look at neuroscience is, um, it's a pointer. It's like so many other pointers we have in this existence to show us our true selves and get back home to where we really experience our being rather than thinking about it all the time. So for me, neuroscience, and I think this is one of the things that I was just doing a video on this where it's one of the things that can turn people off from neuroscience because it's just so much memorization and they're memorizing brain areas and it doesn't seem to connect to our humanity anymore. And so for me, neuroscience is a pointer. It gives us hints about our humanity and what it means, what our existence is. But to get to that deeper, what's the meaning? What's the point of all this? Which we can't help but to add a little bit of philosophy. So I don't think I could do neuroscience without philosophy. So as a neuroscientist, I give philosophy a lot of room. And I think for some people they'd say, well, that's, I forget the term you use, but I've heard a lot of different terms for that. That puts me in that more open-minded, I'd say more open-minded camp. For me, whether it's science or spirituality, it's about tearing away what isn't real. I mean, that's what science does. I mean, you test this hypothesis and you keep testing ones and they turn out wrong, and this is wrong, and then you go through and then you find something that might be pretty good.
Yeah.
And that spirituality is for me too. Spirituality is doing the same thing. You're taking away this illusion, that illusion, and you're just layer after layer, and then maybe you find what's real.
Yeah. And have you got a chance to read Neil Seth's new book, Being You?
Yeah, it's on my shelf. I've peeked at it a little bit, and I haven't got it cover to cover yet, but it looks interesting. But again, it does. There's a lot of I think the debate now, and this is the consciousness conference that's held in Tucson every other year, and it was right before COVID, so it was still in person, and that was the last one I attended. But the main debate really was the question of how to take neuroscience. Should you take it literally? Should you take it absolute in a sense that the brain is the only thing that material? It's really, if you're a materialist, then neuroscience, the traditional version of neuroscience makes sense. There's just brain, there's neurons, there's synapses, there's neurotransmitters. That's it. But then there was the big debate between that version and non-duality, which and it really seemed like it was 50-50, because the non-dualist, which if you look at a lot of contemporary theories of neuroscience, you'll see non-dual theories are working their way into mainstream.
Right.
And so, neuroscience, that's what I was saying, how neuroscience is continuously evolving, because now neuroscience needs to deal with how non-duality is becoming more mainstream, and how is it going to deal with the new ideas about, it's all these different versions that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, but the brain is a transmitter for consciousness is one idea. And that fits in with a non-dualistic philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in Western science too, it has a lot, is always based on a lot of assumptions. And so maybe that's a good segue into what are the assumptions that usually Western science is based on, and is that now compatible? Are those assumptions changing? Are they now compatible with Eastern thought?
Yeah, it's a great question, and another one that's just so in debate right now. If you look at, like, Rupert Sheldrake came out with those 10 dogmas of Western science, and that really stirred things up, and because he was pointing out the assumptions of Western science. And fundamental to Western science is the notion of materialism. It really does take seriously this material world. Like, this is all real, and the problem with that is that if you go back to the 1930s and something we're just again trying to catch up on, what was happening with quantum mechanics, and how the most conservative scientists at the time were saying that this real world, the material world that so many of us take so seriously, it's not even made of things that we could consider to be real. And that's something I think we're still digesting today. I mean, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And so there's been so many books recently questioning the fundamentals, the fundamental assumptions of materialism, but then that kind of talks to the science and say, well, materialism is a fundamental assumption of Western science. And when you start questioning that, then we need a new science. Right. So people started to develop new scientific methods to deal with the possibility that this world that we assume to be so, there's obviously some element of reality to it, but you've got all the computer science people saying it's a simulation. And so now we're not taking the material world as seriously as we did before.
Yeah. I take it that we're we're questioning a lot more of the assumptions than we used to, especially this idea that perceptions were bottom up. And so, I'm hearing from a lot of the neuroscience today is now perception really is created from the top down. That we create what we see and feel and hear, and then that's corrected by what we term the real world. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that to me is one of the, and this is one of the things I'm working on. My next book is coming out maybe next summer, and actually get into that a little bit, because when you look at the history of humanity, for the vast majority, we were basically naive realist, which is a philosophical term. It just means that we assume that my perception is synonymous with reality. It's accurate. And then in the 60s, particularly, we can actually give a date to it. 1967, Neisser, who was maybe one of the first cognitive psychologists, gave up the definition of cognition. And in it, we see the complete rejection of naive realism. So he defined cognitive psychology, or thinking, as taking sensory input, transforming it, reducing it, elaborating it,
Right.
and then storing this reduced, elaborated, transformed. We store that as memory.
Hmm.
And so none of what we remember to be true is accurate, because none of our perceptions are as the world actually is. We're perceiving the world as we transform, change it, elaborate, edit it. And so
Yeah.
the very definition of cognitive psychology, which underlies the entire cognitive revolution,
Mhm.
that's why I really do think it was a revolution. We went from believing we are ap- uh, accurate perceivers of the world to recognizing that it's just my perception.
Right.
It's not the world as it is; it's how I perceive it, and and of course we've got cognitive therapy that was a spin-off of this. And
Yeah.
cognitive therapy has recognized that these inaccurate perceptions lead to anxiety and depression, and we have to become conscious that we're not perceiving the world as it is, but as we think it is. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's extreme writers like Donald Hoffman who obviously say what we're perceiving is not at all resembles what is metaphysically true. It's more about fitness and adaptive value. So, but along with that, what really trips me out is what we think of what's going on internally. So obviously, I think, always thought, have never questioned the unified, consistent, continuous self of me, of Hugh, right? And this, I can voluntarily decide what to do from one moment to the next, and that itself is deeply in question. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, that was one of the attractive things about Eastern philosophy. Well, a little bit of a paradox too, because, it's a tough thing when you identify so much with your ego, which I was a lot in my 20s. And then you've got Eastern philosophy telling you that it's an illusion.
Mhm.
And again, that was one of the main things that started to match up with neuroscience, because neuroscience, regardless of their efforts, could not find the self anywhere in the brain. And then the findings of the split brain patients were able to at least localize the places of the brain that makes up the story, the idea of the self. But they found it was just a bunch of confabulation, and so it really fit the story that we're hearing from the Buddha's second lecture on no self, and it wasn't terribly complex. What the Buddha was saying is, look, there's two things I'm going to focus on: the idea of control and the idea of stability. And he's like, if it was as it seemed to be, again, so we're doing all these revolutions where the world isn't as I thought it was. I thought it was, I thought all my perceptions were real. Now I'm understanding that my perceptions are illusions, and they may not be totally inaccurate, but they're not exactly the way the world is. And now we're picking up this new idea that's about 2,500 years old that the Buddha was teaching, and we're picking up on the West. But it's really a simple story. So if there really was a me, it should be stable, and I should have some control over it. But anyone who spends even a little bit of time on this, you realize that you really don't have any like, just take someone who's suffering from anxiety. If there was really something tangible to the self, you just say, I don't want to be anxious anymore, and
Right.
you just turn it off. And it's but that's not at all what happens.
Yeah.
And so if you had control of your thoughts, and so I do a couple exercises in the new book about how so many of our thoughts just never pan out. We worry about maybe test results, and we worry about this, and so many of our worries just never turn out to be true. But there's no switch in there where it's super easy for us to just go in and flick the switch, and we're not going to think about it anymore. So that aspect of the self, it's pretty easy to examine and figure it out. That if there was some kind of pilot up here, I would have more control over my thoughts and my emotions, but I don't. These emotions just happen. And the stability was another point that the Buddha made. And again, you don't really even need neuroscience for this, but a simple introspective analysis throughout even a single day. So I have an exercise in the book about how many selves you have in a day, and you start recognizing that there's so many selves. And right now, we have a self, and then a couple hours from now, or even a couple of minutes from now, that self can change. And so you start adding up how many selves you have in a day, and you realize that there's so many of them. And you say, but then, well, what about the core? There's got to be a core underneath it.
Right.
And then you realize that core is just another thought. That it's so the same thing that gives rise to the thought of the stable self is the same thing just giving a rise to the other illusion that there's some self behind the selves. And then you start realizing it's just the flow. There's a flow of thoughts, and there's no thinker behind them. And that can be, again, at first, I think, particularly to a lot of Westerners, it can be a little threatening. But when you make the connection about the problems associated with the self, it can be very freeing. And so you're not committed. And one of my favorite Alan Watts quotes is that you're under no commitment to be who you were 5 minutes ago. That's a wonderfully freeing experience.
Yeah.
So you let go of the self and, like, maybe I'm an introvert, but I don't have to be. And then, and the next second, I'm not an introvert, and you don't have to be depressed. You didn't sign a contract that said I'm going to be depressed today, and so you can change. The losing of the self turns out to be a wonderful blessing,
Mhm.
and an adventurous ride.
Yeah. But and here's the main issue for me, and I've realized for a lot of people is so many years ago, I was confronted with this issue. It made sense to me that there's no self, that there's the whole notion of free will that I could have done otherwise than what I did is an illusion. What do you do with that? Because obviously, intellectually, cognitively, you can understand that. You can understand the incoherence on the other side, but this feeling of having a continuous, voluntary, free will, self creating self is so powerful, so strong that that's kind of the world we live in. So it doesn't matter what you think. That this is more of pondering your navel. What can we do about kind of shifting gears uh, beyond the mental?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example of the difference between intellectually understanding something and feeling it to be true. And I think that's a lot of what happens. In fact, you see that a lot with spirituality. People learn the terms, but at the same time, they get into this kind of competition of who's more spiritual, and that can kind of be a fun, you know, thing to play around with. But this is one of the things I go into quite a bit, that um, the thinking mind has us kind of possessed in a way. If you even go back to Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and so much of Western culture has been dominated by thinking, and the whole world has been transformed by this thinking mind, the process of thought. And one of the things I think we're experiencing as human beings is that there's more to our human experience than just thinking. And of course, this is why there's been a huge amount of books and just in the last 10 to 20 years on emotion. And it's almost like we're rediscovering that we're emotional creatures. And that's kind of interesting because if you look at the evolutionary progress of mammals and life on the planet, we were feeling creatures 600 million years before we started to think. In fact, thinking is so new that it may only go back like 40,000 years we started to think the way we think now, dominated by language, dominated by interpretation and categorization and labeling. And in a thinking world, you feel like you know something if I can give a name to it. And so you go to medical school and you learn all the names for all, and then suddenly you know about the human body. But that thinking is just one mode of processing. And I think what the East knew a lot sooner than we did in the West is that there are other modes of knowledge, there are other modes of wisdom, and it's not all contained in thinking. And so they have, so your question, what do we do with this? It's interesting because if you look at teachers like Nisargadatta or Ramana Maharshi, there seems to be a kind of a consistency with them where they simply tell you what do you care about the mind? It's not who you are, which is to say that thinking process, which I put in the left brain, it's not who you are. It's not your true identity. It's just something playing you or pretending to be you. So if it goes off and it creates a self, or if it creates the idea of a self, or if it takes the self real seriously, what do you care? It's not who you are. And you see this in a lot of different spiritual traditions. Really, I think it was Eckhart Tolle. He didn't come up with this, of course, but he made it really popular. The idea of becoming the witness. So we have all these thoughts all day, and they may be thoughts about me and being a self and taking the self. And then you just instead of getting caught up and identifying with those thoughts, you would just become the witness of those thoughts. And that's a really simple but very powerful practice. So you don't really care too much about what goes on intellectually.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really the basis, and how I understand cognitive behavioral therapy, but also what came afterward was acceptance commitment therapy, was just these now defined processes of diffusion of from our thoughts and feelings and a fluid sense of self, and creating that space in our head where we can now practice experientially getting past, or working with our anxiety and depression, or whatever that we're experiencing at the time. But we can't help put things in language of subject, verb, predicate, where I do this. So the whole basis of psychology, it seems, is you have control over what you do. So you do this, and if you don't do this, then there is inevitable shame and blame for not accomplishing it. Even though there's a process of trying to get rid of the shame and blame, and move to a more functional aspect. But you can't remove that out of language, can you?
Now, I find it really, I use the phrase "I" all the time, and it's so tied in with language. It's very difficult, and I've tried it sometimes. I've tried, you could really spend some time trying to create a language that doesn't reflect dualistic ideas of the self and ego, but and that could be an interesting practice. I could kind of show you how you've been sort of taking this all for granted and you've been buying into a bunch of assumptions, and that might be worth some time. But again, the language is so centered around I. Very interesting. I think I mentioned it in the book that people are familiar with the story of Helen Keller, but blind and couldn't hear, and so she really had no language. And it was interesting that the way she described it, that as soon as she had language, then she suddenly had a sense of self. And there's been quite a bit of work on this. And of course, I put it both in the left brain, because the left brain creates language, and the left brain creates a sense of self. So there is some kind of interesting connection between language and the self. So it's very, can we separate the two? I think And of course, this is exactly what you find in the East. This kind of distrust of language. They not in a kind of suspicious way. They just recognize that language is just a symbol, and just as the self is. And they would never confuse a finger pointing to the moon with the moon. And yet in the West, we seem to do that all the time, because we get the language becomes the beginning and the end, and we don't realize that sometimes that language is just a pointer. It's just a sign. And you see so many debates, particularly debates in Western culture right now, that we debate the language, because language has gone beyond a symbol. It's become instead of a pointer to something, it's become the end result. And we kind of stay there and we forget. It's like going to you see some sign that says California 2,000 miles, but you just sit there and keep staring. You think that's California, and it isn't. It's just pointing you in a direction. So the more I read about Eastern philosophy, the more I really felt the purpose of language. And I really didn't take language as seriously as I did before. And that is a huge, it's like I talk about sometimes when imagine you're at the airport and you're carrying a bunch of luggage around, it's not even yours. And then you put it down and you feel that sense of weightlessness and relief. And as soon as you recognize language as simply a tool, it's useful, it's limited, and you use it when it's useful, but then you don't take it too seriously. And it was very tied in with the self. And I think when the self goes, I think language tends to go with it.
Yeah. So then, this is a fair question. I hope it's a fair question. How do you properly then conceptualize what's happening right now between me and you? What's is it two? Is obviously not two individuals talking in a non-dualistic sense. What's happening right now?
That's such a wonderful mystery, and I think that's what the thinking mind looks at it as a mystery to figure out. And I think I see this with the debates between Western materialism and non-dualism. In the Western world, we're so convinced, and we've had some success with this. So it really convinces us that all these puzzles are we can figure them out if we just give it enough time, and if we think hard enough, that we'll finally find the mysteries of the universe. And you can see that as a quest for not just physics, but that's been the quest for consciousness. There are so many researchers out there that honestly feel they will, if they just do the math hard enough, if they just think and conceptualize enough, that they will figure out the mystery of consciousness. And from my position, I really think that's impossible, because the way I look at it is, whatever this reality is, consciousness, whatever it is, it's far beyond our ability to think about. It's far beyond our ability to put into words. It's, just consider the thinking. And this is one of the wonderful things about cognitive science, is it's pointed out so much about the thinking process. We can think, just like we're here talking, we can think one thought at a time. And again, the way we think is so connected to language. And that's just so I can say one word at a time, and exactly the way I think. And so the voice in the head that we've all become so aware of lately, if you become the witness to it, you notice that processes one word at a time. But reality is not one word at a time. Reality is this grand multiplicity. Whatever reality is, really, it's far more complex than this tiny little spotlight of one thought at a time could ever imagine. So I've long given up that quest to. In fact, not only have I given up the quest to ever figuring out consciousness intellectually, I actually take some joy in that. It just feels more like that was the point, I guess. You figure it out by realizing that it's not something to figure out. That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and you talk a lot about the difference between left brain, right brain. The left brain has always been the language categorical side. The right brain, the more spatial and intuitive side. is that more of just a metaphor or model, or is that there's some um, reality to that? How much of that is that a mix?
Yeah, it's a really deep question,
Uh,
and it goes back to what you might consider reality, and what you consider how seriously you take this materialistic world. For a growing number of people, although I think this has been very true for Eastern philosophers for a long time, people are beginning to see that this material world is not the end. It's not the fundamental reality, but more of a metaphor that points to a deeper reality. And so when I talk about neuroscience, I guess I'm one of these newer and more unusual neuroscientists that I take the brain sincerely. I think it has some very valuable things for us to discover, but I don't take it seriously in the sense that I think that this material world is the ground of our being. So I take everything around me, whether it's brains or computers or even this body, that it is a metaphor, and which is to say, it's a pointer
yeah.
to some kind of deeper reality that the mystics have been talking about for thousands of years.
Uh,
It's just Western science is just on the verge of taking this deeper reality a little bit more sincerely.
okay. All right. That's it's a real
It
deep
is.
conceptual thought. Can you kind of lay out what you've talked before about the levels of reality? You're talking about first, second, third level, and so people understand, and then really we can talk about that kind of metaphorical reality a bit deeper.
Sure. So I consider the most superficial level of reality one that so many of us are deeply caught up in right now. And that's the level of thinking, symbols, representations, um, the finger pointing to the moon rather than the moon. It's a world of words and egos. And again, these are all thoughts. It's what the thinking mind does. So that is what I conceptualize as the most superficial. And again, I know that's judgmental, but it's the most superficial level. I call it level one. And then level two is what we might call material reality. And so this is matter. This is things like computers and cars and the earth and bodies and brains. But then we have to be a little careful with level two because we have to realize that all we know about this world is our senses of it. And this is, of course, something philosophers pointed out a long time ago. I don't really know, I mean, all I know about this cup, is my sensations of it. So I see it and, I can feel it and I can feel its weight. And so it's almost an inference that I see it kind of indirectly, but there's wonderful consistency. So we can talk about the material world. Maybe it's having some type of reality to it. And again, what is metaphor? And so when we talk about metaphor in an ordinary way, most of the time it's taking level one, these abstract ideas, and mapping it to level two, the material world. So again, if we say, Juliet is the sun or any other metaphor in poetry, we're always taking these really abstract ideas and giving them some grounding in that level two. And for so much of psychology, that is what understanding is. So we wonder, like, how do I know when I understand something? We understand through metaphor. And so I tell people, get really good at going from level one to level two, because that might actually help you when you go from level two to level three. So level three is the world of the mystic. It's the ocean that the mystic swims in. I've been calling it the desert of the real because I've always been caught up in the Matrix series, although I have to admit I have not seen the most recent one, which I'm not sure why. It seems like, but again, the desert of the real is just asking the question is, what is fundamental? What is the fundamental reality?
Right.
And for me, the fundamental reality is consciousness, but not the type of consciousness that we typically think about. So, usually consciousness has thoughts, it has content.
Mhm.
For me, the desert of the real is awareness with no content. It is consciousness without anything that it's thinking about, without any experience, without any particular. And to me, that's, and again, all I'm saying is words. So,
Right.
they're again just pointers, because
Yeah.
all we can do is point to that reality. But it is, how do we know it's there? Um, it's from either experience directly, or we know it's from the mystics for thousands of years that pointed to this. And and we don't have to. It's very easy to stay your entire life at level one.
Mhm.
You can take your job really seriously. You could take all these identities, all these abstractions, and you can take them all quite seriously. And lots of us live our lives like that.
Mhm.
And that's not a judgment. I could go more into Maya and kind of some of the ideas of Advaita, and why we get caught up in illusions
Mhm.
in the first place. But some of us, we're just drawn. We kind of want to play around with the material world a little bit, and then some of us kind of want to see what's fundamental, and so we stop thinking. And that's the easiest way to get to level three. If you stop thinking, um, some interesting experiences start to happen.
Yeah. So is it fair to say then that what you're saying, every experience that we have, if I'm cutting the grass, I'm staring at the grass, or I'm listening to a podcast, or I'm reading a book, every experience is necessary for me, and that experience is beyond surface level, that there is a deeper meaning to it, that what I'm staring at really is a metaphor.
I So to give it kind of another metaphor, I'd kind of liken it to how a director uh, and a writer put together a movie.
Uh-huh.
And so, you can imagine an actor in a movie, but in a way, the it's already written, it's already done. And so and again, that sounds kind of deterministic, but that's because we're looking at it from our view from our ego.
Mhm.
Our ego wants to be the pilot, our ego wants to be the director.
Mhm.
And this is one of the things that neuroscience is I mean, if you could say anything's conclusive in science, they've shown that feeling you get of me being the uh, author of my story, of me even deciding something as simple. So they take these experiments and they say, "Well, move your finger." So you think, well, that's pretty simple. When do I move? But the brain decides way before you get that feeling of deciding. Maybe even 6 seconds. So your brain's already, this stuff's already happened. 6 seconds, and then you get the feeling of being the pilot. So I think neuroscience and Eastern philosophy has shown so conclusively that feeling of us being the author, of us being the pilot, of us having any kind of real decision making, that is just completely illusory. But then you say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that life is meaningless and I'm just a puppet?
Uh-huh.
But I don't think that's true either. But that's when we have to get to that level three, when you dabble in mysticism a little bit,
Mhm.
and you start losing the ego, and you feel like, instead of feeling like you're that drop of water, you feel like you're the ocean,
Right.
and then everything feels a little bit different. Then
Mhm.
you kind of feel like it's not my ego running the show, but that doesn't mean that I'm just a puppet either.
Yeah.
And that's where we find all these categories that are created by thinking. And that's what thinking is. Thinking is all about creating categories: good, bad, up, down, left. I mean, every thought is a category. And when you stop thinking, you realize that reality isn't really very categorical. And so it's not free will, but it's not determinism. It's some strange option C, I like to say. And so in philosophy, again, we put so many of these things. I have students all the time. They come to me. They want to know whether I believe in free will or determinism. That's a big question I always get.
Yeah.
And I
Like
always
there's
say,
a dichotomy. Yeah, there's a false dichotomy between the two.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like option C. I like, maybe it's something that is just beyond our ability to think about.
Mhm.
You know,
Right. Right.
not perfect, but we're not. But the idea of being in charge or being in control, that's probably not like the way we think about being in control.
Right.
It's probably not like that. The way
Yeah.
we think about like a single entity, and we can't get away from this, whether it's a business. I mean, it's just the way we structure things. We have a central, command center,
Mhm.
and it's just part of how we think. But that's not the way nature works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's and complex systems we're discovering that, they're very intelligent. I mean, nature has nature, the universe, the laws of physics, all these things are incredibly intelligent, but there's no command center.
Right.
You know,
Right.
a plant grows, a flower grows, and no one is telling. There's no rule book. It's wonderful when you go out into nature and you see, all this magnificent things take place, and they don't have any like um, handbook. And we go to work, and we've got these big handbooks of conduct, and here's our big set of rules. But nature doesn't need any rules, and yet it does things that we can't even think about.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, though, we seem to innately have rules for how we determine reality and function. I mean, for example, I mean, you studied neuropsychology, but beyond the science, what we consider like experimental and what can be replicated, and into kind of philosophical or mystical, there's still rules there, right? There's still the rules of has to be logically coherent and or conceptually coherent. Am I getting that right? Where there's the left brain is still required to make sense out of what the right brain may gather.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful, and that's a great point too, because writing a book about this, it sounds like I'm so like, and I had a previous self-published book on this, and I was even a little harder on the left brain in that one. And it
Mhm.
comes across like I'm like anti-left brain, or that I just, or like so many people familiar with Joe Bolte Taylor, her stroke with the left brain, and that brought her instantly into Nirvana. So it sounds like, well, let's just do away with this left brain, and then we'll all be happy. And I think that's such a great point, because that's it's not really where I want to go, but you get that impression sometimes when a system is really imbalanced, and I think our system, particularly in the West, is just imbalanced. So you focus on the right, that doesn't mean you don't want the left. You just want to bring it a little bit more in balance. And so the
Right.
left brain is one. At some point, I may write like a poem or some kind of how magnificent this left brain, you know, uh, uh, ability is to categorize and to organize and to come up with consistency and rules, because it allows us to navigate in this world. And as long as you realize that it's a useful tool,
Mhm.
and then that you're using it and thinking, we don't need to think as much as we think we need to think.
Yeah.
And so we live in a world where we're convinced that thinking will solve all of our problems. Thinking solves. There are definitely times when you want to pull out that left brain talent, and you want to organize this, um and I could probably use that more in my real life. I think I'll write that book once I start committing to it
Mhm.
in life, because I could become. There's so many things. If just a simple little bit of organization would help things in this reality so much. And so yeah, I'm really pro left brain. It's just it comes across like that because we're just imbalanced. And
Yeah.
so and it's not just even a system of imbalance, it's also a system of getting along with the processing of the left brain. And so again, uh, how does the mystic go to get to work in the morning? And well, the mystic wouldn't get to work in the morning if it didn't, like, hey, I got to be here at 8 o'clock. And yes, 8 o'clock is a fiction, and
Mhm.
my company is a fiction. My company doesn't really exist. It's just a bunch of people in a building. But if
Yeah.
I absolutely, too serious, then I'm not going to get paid, and I'm not going to have a job, and
Right.
and
Right.
getting along in this life would be really, it would be a lot more difficult, I think.
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple questions that come to mind. Well, first, I'm glad that you mentioned it, because when I initially read your book, I felt like you were saying that the left side was we could do without it. Yeah, like it's not as important as the right side, but that's not at all what you're saying. Um, Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Jill Bolte Taylor, and you did a really wonderful podcast with her just a few days ago. Um, that is just an amazing story. Well, let me ask more about the evolutionary reasons for why we developed language and in conceptualization. Why was that? Obviously, that's important because we have the structure um, the creation of the self, this continuous self, is important to us. Why is that, do you think?
Okay, just to go back 1 second, just one more last comment with Jill Bolte Taylor. She's such a great example of someone whose left hemisphere was shut off,
Yeah.
and yet the way she so wonderfully tells the story, she really worked hard to get that left brain back on. So it really shows the value of someone who even experienced direct right brain consciousness, that they still appreciate and value the left brain. She worked really hard to bring the processing of her left brain back online. And so now and this really is the point. Then, like at the end of the book, I tried to describe, like, there are two worlds. And the balancing act we do as human beings is to balance well between the two worlds. But then, so why do we conceptualize? What advantage did it have? And that's where I found myself going back. I almost became more of an anthropologist. I was going back into, because so many of us, we think humans just popped up on the planet, and it kind of amazed this story. And this is where I go about a little bit more detail in my new book, because so many of us, we don't even realize like how old our species is, or the fact that there were other humans on the planet. And so I ask people, well, how old is Homo sapiens? And honestly, most of the people I asked, they hadn't a clue how long our own species have been on this planet. And the best estimates, and they're always off a little bit, but it's like 200 to 300,000 years. But so we think about all the time this planet has existed perfectly fine. And then there were other versions of humans, like Homo erectus was around for 2 million years. And but they didn't really advance very much. They used the same for 2 million years. They used the same kind of tools. They used the same kind of, and they did have tools, and they may have had some intellectual abilities in terms of, same thing with people think of Neanderthals as not very bright, but they actually had some ability too for using some symbols and tools. And if so, you think of a tool is a symbol, because, and I think this was so well put in, and the old 70s movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think that's when they showed that primitive humans, and that all of a sudden we had our first thought where they realized, like, this is a bone, but I can also use it as a weapon. It's like the birth of symbolism, the birth of recognizing that it's, things are not necessarily what they appear to be. I can use this as something else. And so that was a really cool way of depicting it. And I always tell my students, that's one of the first things we do. Like the first day of class, I show that clip, because to me, that is the birth of conceptualization. And you say, well, what did it do for us? Well, that was really the first cognitive revolution. So the second one happened in the 60s, when we realized our thoughts were not perfect reflections of reality. But the very first cognitive revolution is when I always call it Mind 1.0. I call it like a mental program that was able to create symbols. And you started to recognize, that's probably when we started speaking. And as soon as we could speak, what people don't realize, but speaking really was the first Wi-Fi. It was the first way we could communicate. Like before then, like I had ideas, but they were stuck up in my head. But when we had language, I could talk to you, and these ideas would just go over the airwaves. And then if you knew the language, you knew the idea. So not only did we have all kinds of new ideas in our head, all these new symbols and abstractions, but I think one of the most important abstractions was that of a group. It's very possible that up until that point, there may have been 8 different versions of humanity, but none of them saw themselves as a group. So we kind of lived harmoniously to some degree, just as other animals on Earth. And in fact, there were a couple times when our species was down in numbers, where we were almost extinct. But then we had this trick where we could see ourselves as a group. And there's a couple different theories out there, like, okay, well, there are 8 different versions of or 8 different versions of humanity. Why did Homo sapiens? Why are we the only one on the planet? And if you've ever taken one of these tests, you may look and it's kind of strange. You take a genetic test and you say, wow, like 1% Neanderthals. And that just like, look, wait, well, so obviously there was some intermating between the different humans. But in the end, you don't see a Neanderthal, working at the drugstore. It's like we're the last. So Homo sapiens did something that allowed us to survive, and all the other species went extinct. And it's hard to say what happened that long ago, but I would guess that it had something to do with conceptualization. It had something to do with us working together as groups. So if we could say, well, we're all Homo sapiens, and we recognize there are enough physical differences that we could categorize ourselves. I mean, think about Neanderthal, way bigger, physically stronger, probably faster. You put one Homo sapien against a Neanderthal, we would always lose. But you put 20 Homo sapiens against one Neanderthal. And so we were able to conceptualize us and work together as a social system. And that may be the reason. So we may actually be here. Our existence may be due to our ability to conceptualize. And so I look at it as really a blessing. We all, like, literally, I wouldn't be here as a Homo sapien. I'm not sure what would be here. Maybe some other form of humanity would have been here. And I don't, who knows what happened all those years ago. But now we may never know because we're just looking indirectly. But something clicked. Something happened where our fundamental ability to think changed. And once the program kicked in, it stuck with us. So one of the things I talk about in my classes, I say, look, the reason we make, and cognitive psychology cognitive therapy in particular, goes over all the cognitive errors that we make. And I try to explain to people that that's because this program is so old, it still thinks it's 100,000 years ago. And that, we live in such a different world. And there's no update for the software. So this thinking mind, it's so out of date. It's living in a world that's so different than the one that we live in that we need some way to update it. And, think about your computer. What would happen if you had a 20-year-old computer that was never updated? You couldn't use it. But what about a 40,000-year-old program that hasn't been updated?
Right. Yeah. No, it got me to thinking about the basis for evolutionary thinking is there's biological evolution, there's cultural evolution, and that's speeding up. Cultural evolution is rapidly changing. Who knows where we're going to be 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now. But all that's based upon an adaptive fitness advantage. Do you think that assumption is too narrow to think? Is it just too narrow of a scope?
I think it fits the material version of reality. So going back to level 2, and we try to figure out how did I grow a body? How did all this the whole story of genetics and survival of the fit? I think it works if we're dealing with level 2. Yeah. And we're trying to figure out that type of reality. Does it give it? So again, the problem with that is that so many evolutionary psychologists, they get tied in with this blind chance. And then suddenly we're just, fancy apes, and then they lose touch with the meaning of our existence. So they just think of evolution as this chance, survival of the fittest, and it's only the strong survive, and it's a blind watchmaker. There's no supreme intelligence to the universe. It's all just random gene mutation is what we owe our success to. And so that's where, like, if you stick at that level, life becomes a little bit meaningless, and because meaning isn't found at that level. And then so that's the point I make about some time being spent at level 3, because that's where the meaning of our existence is at. Yeah. And it's very difficult to articulate. It's very difficult to talk about. And that's why the mystics rarely talk about it. They talk about the pointers. They write poetry, and they want to get you there on your own. And until you've been there, and I don't mean your ego, but until there's the experience of it, it's all just another abstraction.
Yeah. And I noticed that we cannot help but talk in a dualistic way of we're going somewhere that we have
Yeah.
when we're we have um, problems within that we create that we got to figure out, right? And so this is all of behavioral science today. Is although we recognize the kind of the legitimacy or the coherence of a non-dual world, we always, in fact, talk in a kind of a dualistic way of, hey, there's these problems we got to figure out, or I'm not good enough the way that I am. If I want to get from point A to point B, and that's the whole of behavior change. When we talk in behavior analysis about, well, was going from A to B to C, right, and separating those out and categorizing it. Is there a way to talk about that or think about that in a non-dual way that's more helpful?
Hmm. I don't know. The wonderful thing about Zen koans is they throw so many
Yeah.
paradoxes at you, and to me, when we even hint at level three, we're talking about paradox after paradox, and because it's from our perspective, it all seems very paradoxical. But I don't. Who was it who said that? Uh, 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 Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And so, I may be super inconsistent because I may jump between the different worlds, and I may give the appearance of me being so I may work out, and I may, and I watch what I eat, and you say, well, what do you care?
Mhm.
This is just an illusion, and why don't you just let your body fail because everything is really level three. And to me, no, it's a balancing between these three. And so you say, well, I'm here, and whatever. Maybe this is a simulation, but isn't it better to go through the simulation uh, if you could focus on a healthy, body as as someone going as a thing going with you during this process. And so, yeah, I focus on health. I focus on some of the very basics of keeping in shape, just because uh, even if this is a simulation, you're still going. A simulated jail would still feel like jail.
Mhm.
And if you're going through the simulation uh, and your health is failing, maybe it's not the ultimate reality, but it's still going to feel real at the time. And so so many but you also made a really good point too about how again, another paradox, because there's a paradox between accepting me as I am right now
Mhm.
and this endless thing we get on with self-help. And so then I say, okay, well, you need to lose this much weight and have this much endurance, and you have to and then you're running marathons, and then you're running two marathons, and then suddenly you're running these some people run these ultra long distance marathons of like and it just keeps going on. So and that's one of the ways in which this kind of self-help movement has backfired. So again, it's a real paradox between accepting yourself absolutely right now as what you are physically, what you are mentally, and saying, I'm not going to get on the self-improvement bandwagon. I'm just not doing it because
Yeah.
I accept myself for who I am. But
Yeah.
at the same time, and this is why it seems so paradoxical, at the same time, maybe I do watch what I eat, and maybe I do work out, and maybe I do enjoy, and you go for a run, and then get on the treadmill, but it's a paradox because you're embracing both worlds at the same time.
Yeah. And for me, it's the difference between behavior that's forced and what Watts talks a lot about is we got to create this, we got to force it to happen as opposed to just allowing it to happen and accepting what is. That behavior change, yeah, I think he makes a metaphor of like ought to be a slicing through warm butter.
Mm.
True behavior change towards something we determine to be good, um, um, I guess should be easier than what we created to be.
Yeah, it's wonderful. My own story, because I start the book off with my father dying, which was really my first close experience with death, and I had become so neurotic, and I had become a mess of worries at death, and continuous. Like every thought, every moment I had in my 20s was thinking I was going to die the next moment. So I was really a neurotic mess. And the thing that just stood out for me is when I absolutely surrendered to any attempt to try to improve where I was. Because every time I tried to make myself better, if I meditated with the intent of like, I'm going to fix my neurosis, it made it worse.
Right.
Everything I did made it worse because I was trying to escape what was happening. I was trying to escape where I was at when I absolutely just gave up on it. And I can remember this exact moment I did this. I just said, I can't deal with this anymore. I give up. It was a moment of absolute surrender where I stopped trying to change. I stopped trying to have effort. I just said, this is reality. Whatever is going to happen, I have total acceptance and total faith that it's going to happen.
Mm.
And at that moment, all of my anxiety went away. And I just remember being a little freaked out. Like all the stuff I kept trying never worked. When I quit trying, it worked. And I thought, that's a trick. And, in psychology, it's just kind of catching up on that. We're just kind of catching up. That's the paradox of self-improvement. It's like you said, I love that metaphor, just soft butter, because that's the way effort should be. Because the way we think of effort is a sledgehammer against a rock.
Right. Yeah, if it's not hard, it's not worth it. Yeah. And we're running out of time, but just bring me to that there's common themes in a lot of our culture throughout history. I mean, I noticed that in Christian thought and other major religions, that there's this idea of surrender and grace that doesn't involve good works or hard work on our part, but that those are common things. Do you think that, and talking about metaphorically on a third level, that when we notice these kind of core themes throughout history, that now we're hinting on a larger truth, right? So we don't have to necessarily tie it to a certain religion or thought framework, but those generalized common themes in history.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you take all the world's religions, not all the world's religions because there's so many, but if you take, say some of the most popular world religions, and instead of looking at them antagonistically, again, what if you look at them as all pointers? Yeah. And what if they are all pointers to level 3? And I've considered actually writing a book on that exact topic and there have been other books on that too, but Huxley and stuff, but it really does seem to, there's an amazing harmony, not just a harmony, but when you look, it's almost like the different religions that can fit together more like pieces of a puzzle. And once they fit them together the right way, then they become even a bigger pointer to this deeper reality. And so we could really be, and that's one of the things about, maybe one of the real positive things about social media, because, we hear so many negative things, but it's allowed this kind of global communication where diverse people, we could talk across barriers and boundaries so much that people are, instead of arguing about it, we're figuring out, well, maybe it's not, again, A or B, it's actually C. Maybe these things fit together and complement each other. And they could be put together in a way that could be a pointer that would illuminate the human experience to a point that we've never experienced before. And I think that could really happen, even in my lifetime.
Yeah. I'd like to leave off, if you would, about practices and what you do, how first off, how you've transformed. If you can describe a little bit about that, and what you do on a kind of daily basis to get in touch with your right brain consciousness.
That's one of the things, and so I teach a class in mindfulness, and I've really come to recognize that we all are on a kind of our own trip, and things work a little differently for different people. And so I always present these practices as a buffet. I say, look, we're going to go through all kinds of things, and I want you to think of it just like a buffet at a restaurant. Go through it and be really practical. Find out what works. and I think Bruce Lee put it well when he was talking about his teaching in martial arts. He said, find what works, what doesn't work, and don't be afraid to put your own spin on things here and there. And so that's been kind of the way I found my own transformation. I was very practical about it. Once I had the surrender experience, that was followed up by mostly practical things that, so for example, I tried Zazen, the sitting meditation, and it just didn't work for me. And then I tried Tai Chi. Now, Tai Chi for me worked so much better. It was a moving form of meditation. And it was almost like my body just vibrated better with that. And so in my experience, you really have to, when you think about it, think about something as simple as buying a car. You would never just go buy the first car you looked at. And it's so obvious, some people spend a month looking for a car because they want the one that just fits right. And that's just a car. Here we're talking about a vehicle of transformation, personal transformation. So don't just go read some book of meditation. And if you don't like it, then say, well, meditation isn't for me. You might have to try out dozens of different forms of meditation. And you may have to try out different moving meditations, and you may have to, and there's all kinds of techniques out there. And that's why actually in my second book, we're not sure exactly how many different exercises we're going to have. It may be maybe 30 or 40 or more exercises, because they're not going to work for every, we have these subtle differences in us, and we're at like different places. And so, I really don't think you can do one fits all kind of method. And but then you have to be really you're the player in all this, and you have to be very mindful. And when we say, well, what works, as you go through this, well, what do you mean what works? Because the ego is so, one of the things, again, in my own experience, I found how tricky the ego can be. We go through 1,000 ego tricks where you become more spiritual, but that's just the ego hiding in another form of spirituality. And so you think you're this new improved person, and then, maybe you get in a bad mood or you get angry one day, and then it throws you, and you're kind of like, well, I thought I was supposed to be so spiritual, but here I was yelling at, something, and, that doesn't seem to fit. And so, try as many different methods as you can, and as you go, give yourself a break. Some of my students, when we get into these practices, they're terribly hard on themselves with it. So we'll start off the semester with some mindfulness, and then after 3 months, we'll kind of do a reassessment, and people say, well, I had a really bad mood and I found myself complaining all day. And I'm like, so, it's just like, that's, and so you have another opportunity, and you always have another chance. And so much of it is bring that past, again, like I liken it to like a bunch of luggage that we carry around, and you can just let go of the past. And when you let go of the past, it brings you into the present moment. And the present moment is such a amazing reality to it that it's one of the best ways to directly go into level 3, I think. And so when you get into but as ironic as it sounds, it takes a little time to get into the now. We've habitually filled with so many layers of conditioning, of thinking about the future and reminiscing about the past, that we need a lot of pointers, a lot of different pointers to get us to where we actually are, which is right now.
Yeah. I found what was helpful is Waking Up app with Sam Harris. I use. Do you use kind of daily meditation guides? Do you have any recommendations or any resources that you want to recommend?
Yeah, I'm continuously changing and evolving, and I find that Tai Chi has been throughout the last 15, 20 years of my life. So I guess if I have one practice I've enjoyed is Tai Chi, and I try to do that. It's kind of like if I have a habit, I guess that would be one habit. But I'm continuously, trying out I really enjoy this idea of what the first thing you do in the morning when you get out of bed is, as one foot hits and the other, you just like, thank you. I really like that practice of shifting from complaining to being grateful. But there's such a long list of different practices. I'm probably not one that sticks with one particular besides Tai Chi. I haven't stuck with anything in particular. With breathing techniques, I'm always trying, I enjoy doing the Wim Hof method, and, anything that's new out there, I'll give a shot and I'll try it. Become a pragmatist. William James was a great pragmatist as a philosopher, and, try things out and see where they take you. And it's probably not a coincidence, once you become a little bit more, like I think Jill and I were talking about synchronicities and the importance of it. And the more you get to level 3, the more synchronicities you'll notice. And so it's almost like the universe will just kind of, if it can't get your attention, eventually hit you over the head with some new technique and suits. And so you'll, okay, I'll give it a try. And I forget which one it was. I just happened to be in a couple different forms of meditation where, I would see it somewhere on social media, and it would come, and I ignored it, and then it would come up again. It's almost like the universe is saying, "Hey, try this out." And eventually, I found a little wisdom enough to try, and then I was wonderfully surprised. So always, carefully listen to what the universe is telling you, because it may have some wonderful new technique out there that it's just waiting for you to give it a try.
Yeah. No, that's a good point to leave off on, this being mindfully aware of all the things, of all the serendipity or synchronies that are happening in your life that you wouldn't otherwise be aware of. So you have your book that you wrote a couple years ago, wonderful book, No Self, No Problem. You also have, see it right back there, you have a new workbook coming out?
Yeah, so that should be out this summer, and that is all the practices, because one of the things I get so much feedback from people who read the book. They're like, I love this practice. And I realized you can't fix a thinking problem with more thinking. So I don't want to throw too much philosophy at people, and so I'm kind of like, let's just do a bunch of exercises. Let's do exercise after exercise. And it's almost going to be more of a journaling experience for people. And so I've thrown together, like I said, maybe 30 or 40. It depends what the final ends up as, but it's going to be work. And it's going to hopefully fun, and new things. So this will be like that buffet that I offer the students. It'll be like, look, maybe this exercise isn't for you. Go move on to the next one, and then find which ones vibe with you. And those are the ones you want to go with.
Good. And you also have your video series and your YouTube channel.
Yeah, I love the YouTube. Yeah, it's fun. The YouTube channel has become kind of my classroom. It's like an amazing classroom experience for me now, because I get to interact with people. In fact, most of the videos I come up with are from comments from someone who views, and then they throw a comment out, and I'm like, I can't answer that unless I do another video. And so I've been doing videos now. I'm up close to 200 now, and it's a lot of fun for me because I can get as weird as I want, and there's no one. That's the freedom of social media.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Thank you so much for spending your time with me and answering my questions. It was really, really great meeting you. I love your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Spit on the ground, hold your breath, try to scare yourself to death. Bury your bones under the dirt and tear at your heart and rip your shirt and stomp your feet in disgust. Curse the gray skies if you must, but you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone. And take up your wine, break your heart and give up the race before you start. Drop your drawers and roll around, burn your house right to the ground, go to sleep. Hit your head, screaming till your face is red, but you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone. Blue skies, setting sun, cherry pie.